A brave waitress stood up to defend Big Shaq from public humiliation. But instead of being recognized, she was ruthlessly fired by a greedy, cowardly boss who bowed down to a bitter, spiteful old man. Just one day later, that same waitress didn't just turn the tables. She was given a life-changing opportunity, something no one in that diner could have ever expected. Where are you watching this video from? Comment below. Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep following these inspiring stories. Night had just fallen, and the neon lights of the old Sonny's Diner sign flickered against the damp sidewalks of Berkeley, California. The warm glow from the diner's windows spilled onto the street, where a few homeless individuals huddled against the early winter chill. Inside, the soft clatter of plates and silverware blended with the aroma of freshly baked pies and the rich scent of roasted coffee beans. Jasmine Carter, 29, slipped her hands into the straps of her worn beige apron and flashed a familiar smile at the elderly patrons engrossed in an animated conversation about last night's basketball game. They were regulars, old-timers who had witnessed the golden era of the NBA, men who had seen legends carve their names into the hardwood floor of the league. To Jasmine, Sonny's Diner wasn't just a job, it was home. It wasn't a fancy restaurant, but it was a place of comfort, a space where she knew every customer's preference, who liked their coffee black with no sugar, who ordered waffles with syrup every Sunday morning, and who would get the most heated when talking about basketball. But tonight would be different. The diner's bell jingled. On instinct, Jasmine looked up while wiping a glass dry, and then her heart stopped. A giant of a man stepped inside. At over 7 feet tall, more than 2.13 meters, he made the diner's doorway seem small. Broad shoulders like a fortress, muscles barely concealed under an oversized gray hoodie. There was no mistaking him. Shaquille O'Neal, an NBA legend, a man who had once dominated the basketball court, who had shaken the foundations of the Los Angeles Lakers, who had made every defense tremble, a man powerful enough to shatter a backboard with a single dunk. He had been retired for years, yet his name still echoed in every real basketball fan's conversations. And now he was here, in this tiny little diner. Jasmine wasn't the only one frozen in shock. The entire place had fallen into a stunned silence. An old man at the counter dropped his spoon into his coffee cup, completely oblivious. A young couple at the corner booth turned to each other as if to say, "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Mrs. Martha, an almost 80-year-old woman who came in every night for apple pie, squinted at him before exhaling sharply. "Dear Lord, is that Shaquille O'Neal?" A strange hush swept over the diner. The only sounds were the soft patter of rain outside, the faint jazz tune playing from the old radio, and the pounding of Jasmine's heart against her ribs. Shaq pulled back his hoodie, revealing a strong, mature face, rugged yet kind. He glanced around the room, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, then strode over to an empty booth by the window. No one had fully recovered from the shock. A few customers tried to act casual, pretending not to stare, but their eyes darted toward him every few seconds. Others discreetly reached for their phones, scrolling frantically as if trying to confirm they weren't hallucinating. Shaquille O'Neal, NBA legend, had just walked into Sonny's Diner, and no one knew why. Jasmine swallowed hard and took a deep breath. She had to keep it together. She was a die-hard basketball fan. She had watched Shaq play on TV hundreds of times, but she couldn't let her excitement show. Right now, he was just another customer, and her job was to serve him like anyone else. Steadying her voice, Jasmine grabbed her notepad, approached Shaq's table, and put on her best professional smile. "Good evening, sir. What can I get for you?" Shaq looked up, his eyes warm beneath his sunglasses. Despite his imposing size and legendary status, there was something genuinely friendly about him, like he didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable just by being there. "Just a black coffee. And whatever pie you've got special today?" Jasmine nodded, willing her hands not to shake as she jotted it down. "Coming right up." But as she turned to leave, she could feel the eyes still locked onto Shaq. The hushed murmurs were growing louder. She had no idea why an NBA legend had walked into Sonny's diner, but one thing was crystal clear. Tonight would be anything but ordinary. When Jasmine put her pen down on the notepad, trying to keep her voice steady, a strange sensation crept into the air. It wasn't the buzzing excitement of admirers, nor the curious murmurs of onlookers. This was a different kind of tension, an invisible weight, a suffocating presence, as if a dark cloud was silently hovering over everyone in the room. Jasmine felt it clearly. Someone in the diner was not happy to see Shaq. She turned quickly toward the counter, but in a fleeting moment, her eyes swept past a corner table near the bar, and she saw him. Earl Whitman. The man sat stiffly, his back pressed against the worn wooden chair, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze locked onto Shaq with an expression that was impossible to describe. Cold, hard, unyielding. Earl wasn't like the other regulars. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't impressed. He wasn't pleased. Earl Whitman was a man in his 70s, his silver hair unkempt, his face etched with deep wrinkles, scars of time. He was one of Sonny's diner's most loyal patrons, but also one of its most difficult. Jasmine had always had the sense that, to Earl, this diner wasn't just a place to eat. It was his territory. And there was one thing Earl loved more than anything: Sacramento Kings. A love that had spanned over 4 decades. But it wasn't just love, it was obsession. And if there was one name in the NBA that Earl despised more than any other, it was Shaquille O'Neal. To Earl, Shaq wasn't just a legend. He was the man who destroyed his dreams. Back in the 2000s, when the Sacramento Kings had the best roster in their history, they had faced Shaq's Los Angeles Lakers in the 2002 Western Conference Finals. The Kings should have won. They could have beaten the Lakers. But then Shaq and Kobe Bryant crushed their hopes. For most people, it was just a sports memory, a historic NBA moment. But for Earl, it was betrayal. It was humiliation. It was a nightmare that had lasted over 2 decades. The sleepless nights. The times he sat in front of the TV, screaming in frustration. The years of simmering rage every time he saw Shaq's face on television, grinning in victory. It had all carved itself into Earl's soul like a wound that never healed. And now the giant himself was sitting right in front of him, in his diner, as if mocking his past. Jasmine continued toward the counter, but her instincts told her something was wrong. The way Earl was looking at Shaq wasn't just annoyance, it was pure hatred. His lips were pressed into a tight line. His hand, resting on the wooden table, slowly curled into a fist. Jasmine had worked at Sonny's diner long enough to know that Earl wasn't just some grumpy old man. He was confrontational. He never backed down from an argument, and when someone pissed him off, he never hesitated to provoke. "Please don't," Jasmine thought, her heart beginning to pound. She hurried to prepare a cup of black coffee, trying to get everything done as quickly as possible, but she couldn't shake off the creeping dread. Across the room, Earl suddenly stood up. No one in the diner seemed to notice, but Jasmine did. She knew. A storm was about to break. When she placed the steaming cup of coffee on Shaq's table, he looked up at her with a warm, friendly smile, one of those smiles that had a way of making everything feel a little less tense. "Thank you, sis," Shaq said, his deep voice sincere. Jasmine was about to turn away when she caught movement from the corner of her eye. "Earl!" Her stomach twisted into knots. Shaq hadn't noticed him yet, still casually stirring his coffee. But Jasmine knew. Earl wasn't walking over to have a friendly chat. The atmosphere in the diner shifted. The laughter died down. The lively chatter faded, growing softer and softer until it nearly disappeared. All eyes slowly turned toward Earl as he came to a stop right in front of Shaq's table. He was smaller, older, but his gaze was sharp as ice. The storm was about to explode. Shaq finally looked up, meeting Earl's gaze head-on. Silence suffocated the room. Then Earl spoke. "You're Shaquille O'Neal, aren't you?" His voice was rough, laced with bitterness, sarcasm, and challenge. Jasmine clenched her fists, as if she had just watched someone strike a match and drop it into a barrel of gunpowder. The fight had begun. The room fell silent. No more eager whispers from admiring customers, no more lively chatter. The air was thick, heavy. Every gaze in the diner was locked onto Shaquille O'Neal and Earl Whitman, as if everyone could feel a storm brewing in the tiny restaurant. Shaq remained calm, his eyes meeting Earl's cold, sharp stare. There was no anger, no irritation, just quiet observation. "You make millions of dollars, but I don't see you helping anyone." Earl's voice cut through the silence like a knife. He planted his hands firmly on the table, his eyes burning with bitterness. Jasmine stood behind the counter, her heart pounding. She knew this wasn't just a question. This was an attack. She had worked at Sonny's Diner long enough to know Earl Whitman. He wasn't an easy man to deal with. A die-hard Sacramento Kings fan for over 40 years, Earl didn't just love the team, he lived for it. To him, basketball wasn't just a sport. It was a battle, a matter of pride, a piece of his soul, and no one had crushed his dreams quite like Shaquille O'Neal. In 2002, when the Sacramento Kings had their greatest chance to win an NBA championship, they faced Shaq's Los Angeles Lakers in the Western Conference Finals. It was a brutal series, one where Shaq and Kobe Bryant had dismantled the Kings. Earl never forgot how it felt. The heartbreak, the bitterness, the sense of being robbed of a dream he had waited a lifetime for. To most people, Shaq was a legend, but to Earl, Shaq was the destroyer of the Kings, a villain, an outsider who didn't deserve the wealth and worship that people gave him. And now, that giant was sitting right in front of him, in the very diner that Earl considered his territory. No one trespassed on Earl Whitman's turf without consequences. Shaq set his coffee down, his gaze steady but firm. "I try to give back when I can. I've funded scholarships, built basketball courts for underprivileged kids, and helped struggling families." Earl scoffed, folding his arms, his expression unmoved. "Sounds like a PR stunt." Jasmine bit her lip. She knew Shaq wasn't lying. She had read about it, heard about it, his work in communities, the schools he funded, the programs he started for kids in need, the countless families he had helped across the country. But Earl didn't care about the truth. He wasn't looking for an answer. He was looking for a fight. Jasmine gripped the edge of the counter, her breath steadying. There was something unsettling in Earl's eyes, a fire of resentment that had been burning for years. This wasn't just a conversation. This was a confrontation. And Earl wasn't about to back down. Jasmine knew that if no one stopped him, this could escalate. She could feel the storm coming. The question was, who was going to put it out? The room remained tense, the only sound being the slow ticking of the wall clock. Shaq was still calm, his eyes locked onto Earl. But Earl wasn't finished. He leaned in, pressing his hands harder against the table, forcing Shaq to acknowledge him. "You make hundreds of millions of dollars. What have you done to help people like us?" His voice was sharper now, more accusatory. Some customers shifted uncomfortably. Others quietly moved away, but no one dared to intervene. Jasmine knew this was a critical moment. If Shaq got angry, things could explode. If Earl kept pushing, this could spiral out of control. She clenched her fists and took a step forward, ready to step in. But just then, Shaq leaned back in his chair, folded his arms across his chest, and let out a low chuckle. Jasmine's eyes widened. Earl's brows furrowed, momentarily thrown off. Shaq looked straight at him, a smirk lingering on his face. "You know what's funny?" Shaq said slowly, his deep voice carrying a quiet authority. Earl hesitated, suspicion flickering in his eyes. Shaq leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his gaze unwavering. "I've met a lot of people who hate me, but not many have spent their whole lives holding a grudge over a game that ended more than 20 years ago." The room fell dead silent. Jasmine felt the shift in the air. Earl went still, and Jasmine knew. Shaq wasn't backing down. The real battle had just begun. The room held its breath. The tension was already stretched taut like a string about to snap. But Earl's mocking words only made the air heavier, suffocating. Every eye remained locked on the confrontation between Shaquille O'Neal and Earl Whitman, as if witnessing a battle with no end. A war not just of words, but of pride, of wounds that had never fully healed. Shaq took a slow sip of his coffee, unrushed, unshaken. His gaze was calm to the point of defiance. "I try to contribute when I can. I've funded scholarships, built basketball courts for kids, and helped families in need." His response was not long-winded, not defensive, just a simple, firm statement of fact. But Earl didn't want to hear it. He didn't care about the truth. He only wanted to see Shaq crumble before him. Earl smirked, folding his arms across his chest, his voice as sharp as a blade slicing through the air. "Sounds like a PR stunt." The customers around them began to react. Some nodded in agreement, skepticism in their eyes. Others looked uncomfortable. A few younger onlookers exchanged glances, as if they couldn't believe that someone like Shaq, a man who had helped so many, was being openly disrespected like this. Jasmine, standing nearby, clenched the tray in her hands. Her throat felt dry, her chest heavy, not out of fear, out of anger. Shaq didn't deserve this. She couldn't just stand by and let a man like Earl tear him down over a sports rivalry that had dragged on for more than 2 decades. She took a deep breath, fists tightening, and then, just as Jasmine was about to speak, Shaq gently set his coffee cup down on the table and slowly met Earl's gaze. "So, tell me," Shaq said, his voice steady, "what do you think someone like me should be doing?" Earl hesitated for a split second. He hadn't expected Shaq to turn the question back on him. "I mean this," Shaq continued, his deep voice calm but resolute. "What would it take for me to be good enough in your eyes?" Earl didn't answer right away. The wrinkles on his forehead deepened as if he were searching for a response, but at the same time, he didn't want to admit that he had none. Then, like a cornered animal, he lashed out harder. Lifting his chin, his voice dripped with bitterness. "I've lived long enough to know that rich men like you never truly care about anyone but themselves." Shaq's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't react. Earl pressed on, his voice growing louder, as if he wanted the entire cafe to hear. "You say you help the poor? What about all the people you left behind? How many young players tried to make it but never got the chance because guys like you took all the spotlight?" Shaq remained silent, but his eyes darkened with intensity. Earl wasn't done. His anger flared, and his voice carried the weight of long-held resentment. "You claim to care about the community? Then why are the poor neighborhoods still drowning in garbage? Why are kids still struggling to get an education? If you really gave a damn, why hasn't the world changed?" The room ignited. The tension hit its peak. Some customers looked away, unwilling to get involved. Others gaped, stunned that Earl would go this far. Jasmine felt her chest tighten. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Shaq slowly stood up. He towered over Earl by nearly 2 heads, his frame as immovable as a steel wall. But he wasn't angry. There was no intimidation in his stance, no sharp words in his mouth, only disappointment. He looked Earl in the eye, and for the first time, Earl unconsciously took half a step back. Then Shaq spoke, his voice quiet but carrying through the room. "You know what the difference between you and me is, Earl?" Earl pressed his lips together, saying nothing. Shaq's gaze was unwavering, piercing through the bitterness in Earl's soul. "I don't blame others for the things I can't change." Earl stood frozen. Shaq continued, his tone sharper now. "And I don't spend my life being angry over a basketball game that ended more than 20 years ago." Silence. Complete, unshakable silence. Earl had nothing left to say. Jasmine saw it clearly. Shaq didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. All he had to do was tell the truth, and that truth was enough to break Earl Whitman. Jasmine couldn't stop the faint smile that tugged at her lips, but deep down, she knew one thing for certain. Earl wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat easily, and that worried her more than anything else. The silence in the diner was thick, like an invisible curtain. Earl stood there, his face rigid, his fists clenched as if he were trying to hold back a fury that was ready to explode. The deep lines on his forehead became even more pronounced, his eyes flashing with a challenge. But beneath that, a fleeting moment of hesitation. A hesitation he probably didn't even want to acknowledge. Shaq remained towering, like a fortress in the middle of a storm. He didn't flinch, didn't fear, didn't waver. But in his eyes there was the briefest flicker of surprise. Not because of Earl, but because of Jasmine Carter. The petite waitress had stepped forward, standing face to face with a man like Earl, a man who could crush anyone with his words alone, a man who had never needed to raise his voice to make someone back down. But Jasmine didn't back down. She met Earl's gaze, her eyes steady, her voice unwavering. "Mr. Whitman, that's not true." The air froze. Every eye in the diner turned toward Jasmine, as if they couldn't believe that the quiet girl, the one who always served with a gentle smile, had just spoken with such undeniable force. But Jasmine didn't care about their stares. She pressed on, each word slicing through the thick tension in the room like a razor-sharp blade. Shaquille O'Neal has paid for hundreds of students' tuition, built homes for families who lost everything, and helped countless people. Just because you haven't read about it doesn't mean it didn't happen. The room was deathly still. Shaq blinked, as if he had just heard something he hadn't expected. Earl stiffened. Jasmine didn't step back. She took another step forward, now standing directly in front of Earl. "You don't have to like Shaquille O'Neal. That's your choice. But what you don't get to do is ignore the truth." Earl's frown deepened. He crossed his arms, but Jasmine saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He hadn't expected her, a nameless waitress, someone he had never even acknowledged, to stand up to him. And that unsettled him. It unsettled him a lot. But Earl Whitman wasn't the kind of man to accept defeat easily. His eyes narrowed, sharp like a hawk's, and he tilted his chin up, trying to regain control. "What do you even know about the world, Jasmine?" His voice was edged with frustration, the kind of frustration that came from a man losing his grip. "You think you know everything? You think reading a few articles online gives you the right to stand here and lecture me?" Jasmine didn't falter. She took a deep breath and spoke slowly, clearly, without a single note of hesitation. "I don't need to know everything. I just need to know right from wrong." Earl froze. His lips pressed into a thin line, as if he wanted to say something, but for the first time, he couldn't find the words. For the first time since Jasmine stepped into this fight, Shaq let the faintest smile cross his face. Not a mocking smile, not a smug one, but a smile of respect. He nodded, slowly, then turned to Earl, his deep voice steady and commanding. "She's right, Earl." Earl snapped his head toward him, his eyes burning with anger. But this time, something had changed. Jasmine felt it. A shift, a change in the air. This wasn't just Earl attacking anymore. For the first time tonight, he was facing something he couldn't brush aside. The truth. And the truth was that he was wrong. Wrong for coming after Shaq with old grudges and bitter words. Wrong for pretending he was a better man, when, in reality, he was just clinging to a resentment that no longer had a place. Wrong for thinking that no one would ever stand up to him. Earl clenched his jaw, his gaze flicking from Jasmine to Shaq and back to Jasmine. But he said nothing. Only silence stretched between them. Shaq looked at Jasmine, something flickering in his eyes, something she couldn't quite put into words. But she knew. It was gratitude. He didn't have to say it out loud. Jasmine understood. She hadn't just stood up for Shaq. She had stood up for what was right. And that, more than any championship, more than any victory on the court, was something that truly mattered. But just then, a voice rang out from behind the bar. The voice of the diner's owner, Robert Sullivan. "Jasmine, office, now." The air shifted again. This time, it wasn't about Shaq and Earl. It was about Jasmine and the man who held her job in his hands. And she knew. The storm was far from over. The air inside the diner was thick like glue. All eyes were still on Shaq, Jasmine, and Earl, but now a new kind of tension had erupted, one that was no longer about basketball or old memories, but about power and control. Robert Sullivan, the owner of the diner, emerged from the kitchen, his face flushed red with anger. "Jasmine, get in here, now!" His voice was loud and cold, leaving no room for resistance. Jasmine flinched slightly, but wasn't surprised. She knew. She had broken one of Sonny's diner's unspoken rules. The rule that people like her were supposed to stay silent. She barely had time to glance at Shaq, noticing the slight furrow in his brow, the concern in his gaze as he watched her. But she didn't have time to think. Sullivan had already grabbed her by the arm, dragging her into the kitchen and slamming the door shut behind them. Inside the cramped, grease-filled kitchen, Robert Sullivan stared her down, his eyes burning with fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Jasmine?" Jasmine took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I was standing up for the truth." Sullivan let out a growl, his expression darkening. "The truth?" His lips curled into a sneer, his voice dripping with mockery. "Who do you think you are? Some kind of activist? A journalist? You're a waitress, Jasmine. Your job is to serve customers, not argue with them." Jasmine didn't back down. "But he insulted someone for no reason. I couldn't just stand there and do nothing." Sullivan scoffed, shaking his head. "Do you even know who the most important customers of this diner are? It's not Shaquille O'Neal. It's people like Earl. They come in every day. They spend money. They keep this place running." Jasmine clenched her fists, a bitter taste rising in her throat. "So, what are you saying?" Sullivan stepped closer, his voice lowering but filled with menace. "I'm saying you pissed off one of my most loyal customers, and I can't have that." Jasmine's eyes widened. She could hear the warning in his tone. "You're protecting Earl? A man who threw hateful words at someone else?" Sullivan slammed his hand against the stainless steel counter, making the kitchen utensils rattle violently. "I don't care. You're fired." For a moment, all sound disappeared. Jasmine's heart clenched. Fired? For standing up for someone? For refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice? She stared at Sullivan, hoping, just for a second, that he might take it back. But he didn't. His eyes were cold, decisive, and unwavering. A weight pressed down on Jasmine's chest, but she refused to let herself crumble. Swallowing back her anger, she steadied her voice. "Fine." She untied her apron, placed it on the counter, and lifted her gaze to meet Sullivan's one last time. "You just lost an honest employee. Good luck with this diner." She turned and walked out of the kitchen, not looking back. As Jasmine stepped back into the main dining area, every single eye in the diner was on her. Shaq was still there, his expression filled with concern. She knew. He had heard everything. Earl sat silently in the corner, no longer speaking, but there was a smug satisfaction on his face. He had won. Sonny's diner had chosen him over Jasmine. But Jasmine had no regrets. She looked at Shaq and gave him a small, proud smile. "Thanks for stopping by my diner. I don't work here anymore." Shaq studied her for a moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then he nodded, like he had just made a decision. Jasmine turned away and walked out of Sonny's diner, out of her old life. But she didn't know. This wasn't over yet. The kitchen door swung shut behind Jasmine, but the echoes of the conversation inside still lingered in the diner's air. Shaquille O'Neal stood up, his towering frame making the small restaurant feel even more cramped. But no matter how big he was, he felt small in the face of the injustice he had just witnessed. Jasmine stepped out, her face expressionless, but Shaq could see the hurt buried deep in her eyes. She glanced at him for a brief second before walking on, out of the diner, out of the job she had dedicated years to, out of a world where silence was deemed safer than standing for what was right. Something twisted in Shaq's chest. "I'm sorry." He wasn't sure if he should say it, but before he could even think, the words left his lips. Jasmine didn't turn around. She just whispered, her voice carrying the weight of a final declaration in that diner. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for what's right." And then she was gone. No one stopped her. No one said a word. And that, more than anything, was what made Shaq furious. He looked around the diner, his gaze sweeping across each and every person inside. They had seen it all. They had watched a woman lose her job simply because she stood up for what was right. They had heard everything Earl said, but no one spoke up. No one stood against Sullivan. No one defended Jasmine. They just stayed silent. A deep, profound disappointment filled Shaq's chest. Earl sat in the corner, watching Jasmine leave with a smug, twisted smirk. He didn't have to say a word. Shaq knew exactly what he was thinking. In his mind, Earl had won. And Sullivan. The diner's owner stood behind the counter, arms crossed, his face void of remorse. Shaq clenched his jaw. Number. It couldn't end like this. He took a deep breath, then walked toward the counter. All eyes followed him. Sullivan looked up, trying to maintain a calm expression, but Shaq could see the tension in his eyes. No one could truly be calm when a 7 feet 1 inch, 325-pound man was staring them down like he was about to bring the whole building down. Shaq placed a large bill on the counter. "Tell me something, Mr. Sullivan. How much is this diner worth?" Sullivan frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Shaq gestured toward the bill, his voice deep and unwavering. "I'm asking for the price. If I wanted to buy this place, would you sell it?" The entire diner tensed. Customers gaped in shock, unable to believe what they had just heard. Sullivan hesitated, unsure whether Shaq was joking or deadly serious. "I don't understand." "Let me be clear," Shaq cut in, his voice carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "I don't want to eat in a place where people get fired for standing up for others." His words rang through the room, silencing everything. Sullivan swallowed hard, glancing around nervously. I'm not selling the diner." Shaq nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Then let me tell you something." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, but each word hit like a sledgehammer. "I'm never coming back here again, and I'm going to tell everyone I know, never step foot in here again." Sullivan froze, and then, like a ripple spreading through the room, whispers began. A few customers stood up. Some dropped money on the table without finishing their meals. One by one, they walked out. 1, 2. Then a group. Sullivan's eyes widened as the reality of his mistake sank in. Shaq didn't have to buy his diner to ruin it. He just had to walk out and take everyone with him. Earl remained in his seat, but the smirk had vanished from his face. He looked around, watching as the diner emptied out. Then his gaze met Shaq's. Shaq stared back, not with anger, not with hatred, but with something far worse. Disdain. And that, more than any insult, made Earl squirm. He had won the battle of words, but in the real fight, he had lost. Shaq said nothing more. He simply nodded at a few regulars and then walked out of Sonny's diner, leaving behind a restaurant crumbling under the weight of an undeniable truth. As he stepped outside, the cold night air brushed against his face, and, standing right in front of him, Jasmine Carter. She stood there, pain still lingering in her eyes. Shaq stopped, looking at her. Jasmine lowered her head slightly, as if still carrying the disappointment of what had happened. But Shaq wouldn't let her feel that way. He spoke just one sentence, simple, yet full of meaning. "Come with me. I've got a better job for you." She looked up, surprised, and just like that, a new chapter in Jasmine Carter's life began. Jasmine's small room was bathed in the dim light of early morning. She woke up with a hollow, heavy feeling, like a piece of her life had been stripped away overnight. And, in a way, it had. The diner she had dedicated 3 years of her life to, the place she considered her second home, had betrayed her. Not because of the job, not because of the low pay, but because of the sheer, blatant injustice. Jasmine had always believed that doing the right thing would keep everything in place, but last night had proven her wrong. She lost her job because she stood up for what was right. She lost her job because she refused to turn a blind eye to someone as cruel as Earl Whitman. She lost her job because Robert Sullivan valued a loyal customer's money over fairness. But there was one thing Jasmine hadn't lost: her dignity. She still had her self-respect, and more than anything, she knew she had done the right thing. But life doesn't wait for anyone. Jasmine still had bills to pay, rent to cover, food to buy. Fired or not, she needed to go to Sonny's diner one last time to collect her final paycheck. And then she would move on, find another job, forget about everything that had happened. At least, that's what she thought. Until she got to the diner. Jasmine froze the moment she arrived at Sonny's diner. A sleek black SUV was parked right in front. The vehicle exuded a quiet luxury, its chrome accents catching the morning sunlight, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. She frowned. That car didn't belong here. Sonny's Diner was a small-town, working-class kind of place. The kind of people who came here didn't drive cars like that. She took a breath and stepped forward. A strange feeling stirred inside her, like something was about to happen. Jasmine pushed the door open and walked in, and immediately she sensed something different. Sonny's Diner wasn't the same as yesterday. Gone was the usual lively chatter, the warm buzz of familiarity. Instead, a heavy silence hung in the air. Every eye in the room was fixed on one man, Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq sat at a table by the window, his massive hands resting lightly on the surface, his posture relaxed yet commanding. He didn't have to say a word. His presence alone was enough to silence the entire room. Even Robert Sullivan, still standing behind the counter, looked visibly uneasy. Jasmine could feel it. Something was happening, and she knew. It had to do with her. She swallowed hard and stepped toward the counter. Sullivan gave her an uncertain look, as if he wasn't sure she was supposed to be there. Jasmine kept her voice steady. "I'm here to collect my paycheck." Sullivan blinked, then quickly rummaged through a drawer. He pulled out an envelope of cash and set it on the counter. But just as Jasmine reached for it, Shaq spoke. "Take it, but you won't need it for long." Jasmine froze mid-motion and turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" Shaq leaned forward slightly, his gaze warm yet filled with an undeniable certainty. "I want you to work for me." Jasmine's eyes widened. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Work? For you? Shaq nodded, his deep voice unwavering. Last night, you stood up for the truth. I saw that. I need people like you in my organization. People with integrity, courage, and the willingness to speak up when something's wrong. Jasmine felt her heart pounding. She didn't know what to say. She never imagined that what happened last night would lead to this. Shaq gave a small smile, as if he had anticipated her reaction. I run a foundation. We help families in need, fund education for kids, and create better opportunities for those who deserve them. He met her eyes, his voice as sincere as ever. I want you to be a part of it. I want you to be a part of something bigger. Jasmine was stunned. She had lost her job for standing up for the truth, and now she was being offered a new opportunity, one bigger than anything she had ever imagined. This was fate, and she knew exactly what she had to do. I'm in. Shaq nodded in approval, rising to his feet, shaking her hand firmly. And in that moment, Jasmine Carter understood. She hadn't just accepted a new job. She had stepped into an entirely new chapter of her life. Jasmine could still feel her heart pounding from the moment she stepped through the doors of Sonny's diner. She never thought she'd come back here after last night, at least not under these circumstances. But then she saw Shaquille O'Neal, sitting there, waiting for her. The sleek black SUV parked outside was no longer a mystery. It belonged to him. He wasn't just here for breakfast. He was here for her. Shaq looked at Jasmine with warmth in his eyes, yet there was a seriousness to his gaze. No pity, no condescension, only recognition. I've been thinking a lot about what you did. His deep voice was calm, but there was weight in every word. I can't let someone with a heart like yours go to waste. Jasmine's eyes widened. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Shaquille O'Neal, a legend, an NBA icon, was telling her that she mattered. Not because she was famous, not because she had some extraordinary skill, but because she had stood up for what was right. I don't understand. Jasmine blinked, trying to make sense of it all. She was just a waitress who had been fired for standing up against injustice. She wasn't some big figure in society. She was just a regular person who couldn't stay silent in the face of Earl Whitman's arrogance. So, why was Shaq here? Shaq leaned forward slightly, his massive hands clasped together, his eyes filled with unwavering determination. You don't have to understand it right now, but I need you to listen to me. Jasmine gave a small nod, feeling as if the entire diner had faded away, leaving only the two of them. I've met a lot of people in my life, some of the greatest athletes, the most successful business leaders, the most powerful politicians. He paused for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. But it's rare that I meet someone like you, someone willing to risk everything just to do the right thing. Jasmine took a slow, steady breath. Shaq continued, his voice growing stronger. I run a charity. We help underserved communities, fund scholarships for students, and create opportunities for people who don't have them. He locked eyes with her, his words carrying an undeniable gravity. And I want you to be a part of it. The diner was silent. People were still watching, their eyes glued to this surreal exchange. Robert Sullivan, the owner of the diner, stood frozen behind the counter, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Earl Whitman, the man who had started all of this, sat in a corner, his expression dark and unreadable. Everyone knew exactly what this meant. Jasmine Carter, the woman they had tried to bring down, was about to be given an opportunity far beyond anything they could have imagined, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Jasmine didn't know how to react. She looked at Shaq, then down at the envelope containing her final paycheck. Just yesterday, she had lost everything, and now she was being handed a chance she never thought possible. But did she truly deserve it? She was just a waitress. What could she possibly bring to an organization as big as Shaq's? Shaq saw the hesitation in her eyes, and he gave her a knowing smile. "I know what you're thinking." Jasmine looked at him, waiting. "You think you're not good enough? You think you don't have anything special? You think you're just an ordinary person?" He leaned back, crossing his arms, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "But you've already done something most people are too afraid to do. You stood up, and that's all I need from you." A wave of emotion rose in Jasmine's chest. She had doubted herself her entire life, but for the first time, someone truly saw her worth. Shaq was still waiting for an answer. She took a deep breath, then met his gaze. "I'll do it." There was no hesitation this time. She knew this was the path she was meant to take. Shaq smiled, satisfied, and stood up. He extended a hand, shaking hers firmly. "Welcome to the team, Jasmine." Robert Sullivan lowered his head, as if realizing he had made an irreversible mistake. Earl Whitman remained silent, but his eyes burned with resentment. They all understood one thing. They had lost Jasmine Carter, and now she was stepping into something far greater than any of them. She held the envelope in her hand one last time before stepping out of Sonny's diner. But this time, she wasn't walking away in defeat. She was walking toward something new. One door had closed, but another had opened. She was no longer just the waitress who got fired for standing up for what was right. She was Jasmine Carter, a woman stepping into the next chapter of her life. Shaq smiled, a smile that wasn't just friendly but carried a sense of certainty, of unwavering resolve, as if he had thought this through carefully before making his offer. "I want you to work for my charity." He paused for a moment, letting his words settle in the air. "We need people like you, people who dare to stand up for what's right." Jasmine was stunned. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. Shaquille O'Neal, one of the greatest basketball players in history, was offering her a job at his organization. She was just a waitress who had been fired less than 24 hours ago. She had no prestigious degree, no powerful connections, no fame or fortune. She was just Jasmine Carter, a regular woman who had refused to turn a blind eye to injustice. You're serious?" Jasmine wasn't sure if this was some kind of joke, but there was no hesitation in Shaq's eyes. "I've never been more serious." A surge of emotion swelled in Jasmine's chest. She wanted to say yes immediately, but a voice in the back of her mind made her hesitate. Who was she? She was just a small-town waitress. Could she really be capable of something bigger, something more meaningful? Shaq saw the uncertainty in her eyes and gave her a reassuring smile. "I know what you're thinking." Jasmine swallowed hard, feeling as if Shaq had just read her mind. "You're wondering if you're good enough, if you're worthy." Shaq leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "But let me tell you this. I don't need someone with degrees or status. I need someone with heart." He paused before continuing, his words firm, filled with conviction. You stood up for me when no one else dared. You put justice above your own safety. That's not something just anyone can do." A wave of emotion crashed over Jasmine. She didn't doubt anymore. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't go back to being just another waitress, living in fear that speaking her mind would cost her everything. She wanted to do something that mattered. She wanted to be part of something bigger than herself. Jasmine lifted her gaze to Shaq's, her hesitation gone. She took a deep breath, then smiled, a smile filled with determination. "I'm in." Shaq smiled, satisfied. He stood up and extended his hand. Jasmine didn't hesitate for a second. She grasped his hand, and in that moment, she knew. She had just stepped into an entirely new chapter of her life. No one in the diner spoke a word. The customers could only watch in stunned silence. Robert Sullivan, the owner of Sonny's Diner, stood behind the counter, his face pale. He never imagined that the woman he had just fired would receive an opportunity like this. He had expected Jasmine to leave in defeat, in humiliation. But instead, she was walking away with something far greater than anything he could have ever offered her. Earl Whitman remained seated in the corner, his eyes filled with bitterness. He thought he had won, but now he knew he had lost. Not in a basketball game, not in an argument, but in a battle of integrity. Jasmine turned and walked toward the door of Sonny's Diner for the last time. But this time, she wasn't leaving in despair or pain. She was leaving with a new future. She was leaving with an opportunity to change not just her own life, but the lives of others. And as she stepped outside, the golden morning sun cast its light on the path ahead. She knew a new chapter had officially begun. Jasmine stood there, bathed in the morning sunlight, feeling something she had never experienced before. She had just said yes, a firm, resolute agreement, yet one that carried an entirely new future, a path she had never imagined herself taking. Her throat tightened, not out of fear, but because of the wave of emotions surging in her chest. Everything she had been through in the past 24 hours, being humiliated, betrayed, and fired, had now become the very reason she was standing here, being given this opportunity. And right in front of her, Shaquille O'Neal was looking at her with a satisfied smile. "Good. Starting today, you work for me." Shaq patted her shoulder lightly, like a coach who had just recruited a star player. Jasmine wiped away her tears, but her smile remained. I don't even know what to say." Shaq shrugged, his eyes glinting under the sunlight. "Don't say anything. Just work hard. I didn't pick you for what you said. I picked you for what you did." Inside Sonny's Diner, silence still lingered. Everyone had seen everything. Robert Sullivan, the diner's owner, stood stiff behind the counter, his eyes still frozen in shock. He had thought that firing Jasmine would be a lesson for her, a warning that she should never stand up against those in power. But now he was witnessing the exact opposite. The one who had been knocked down wasn't Jasmine. It was him. He had just lost his most dedicated employee, all because of his own cowardice, and, what made it worse, Shaquille O'Neal had seen it all. Earl sat motionless in the corner of the diner, his eyes dark and hollow. For the first time throughout this entire battle, he said nothing. No more sharp, mocking words, no more false accusations, no more smug victories, only bitterness, because he had lost. Not in an argument, not on a basketball court, but in a battle far more important, the battle of dignity. Jasmine hadn't just stood up to him. She had stepped out of his shadow and into a world he could never reach, and that enraged him more than anything else. Shaq pulled open the car door, motioning for Jasmine to get in. She turned to look at Sonny's diner one last time, the place where, just 24 hours ago, she had been nothing more than a waitress with a stable job. But now, she was leaving as an entirely different person. Jasmine stepped into the car and shut the door. The engine purred, and the SUV rolled off the sunlit curb. She didn't look back, because she knew she never would. Shaq glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his expression filled with confidence. Ready to change the world? Jasmine took a deep breath, then nodded. Ready? The car sped up, merging into the busy traffic. One door had just closed, but another had opened, one leading to a future Jasmine had never dared to dream of. Jasmine Carter walked out of Sonny's diner, but she didn't leave with regret. There was no fear, no bitterness clung to her anymore. She walked away with an opportunity, a future, a path she had never thought she could take, a path not just for herself, but for many others as well. She understood now that sometimes loss is the best thing that can happen. She hadn't lost a job, she had found a purpose, and it had all started with a simple decision, to not stay silent in the face of injustice. Fate had answered that decision. A sleek black SUV sped down the bustling streets of San Francisco. Inside, Shaquille O'Neal drove with ease, not in a rush, but with confidence. Jasmine sat in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed on the window, watching the towering buildings blur past. Just a day ago, she had been serving coffee to regular customers. Now, she was sitting beside one of the greatest legends of the NBA, on her way to an entirely new life. "Where do I start?" Jasmine asked, her voice carrying both excitement and a hint of nervousness. Shaq chuckled softly, his eyes filled with understanding. "I don't expect you to change the world overnight, but I do expect you to be willing to learn." He glanced at her briefly before continuing. "Your first job is simple. Come with me to a charity center. I want you to meet the people we're helping." Jasmine nodded, feeling warmth spread through her chest. This wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity to make a difference, and she was ready. While Jasmine stepped into a new path, Sonny's diner was no longer the same. Robert Sullivan remained behind the counter, frozen, his gaze hollow. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had fired Jasmine, thinking he was teaching her a lesson, that standing up to power only led to loss. But instead, he was the one who had lost. Now, as he looked around the diner, he realized it wasn't the same anymore. Shaq was gone. Jasmine was gone. The loyal customers he once believed would never leave were gone too. Those who had witnessed the injustice last night now understood that Sonny's diner was no longer a place they wanted to support. The diner felt cold, like a relic of an old era, a place where fear and submission had once been the norm. And now, with Jasmine walking out of their lives, they finally realized what they had lost. Earl remained seated, his cup of coffee long gone cold on the table before him. He stared out the window, where the black SUV had disappeared from sight. In his mind, there were no more voices, no more justifications, no more bitter satisfaction, only emptiness. He had spent his whole life hating Shaquille O'Neal, holding on to resentment like a twisted badge of honor from the past. But now, he realized, Shaq had never lost. It was him. He had been the one trapped in defeat for the past 20 years. And Jasmine, the waitress he had once dismissed as insignificant, unimportant, had walked away from the cycle of bitterness he had imprisoned himself in. She had won. And he was just an old man sitting alone in an empty diner. On the highway, Jasmine looked over at Shaq, a sense of anticipation growing inside her. She didn't know what lay ahead. She didn't know if she could truly make a difference. But she knew one thing for sure. She would never bow to injustice again. And for the first time in years, Jasmine Carter felt like she truly mattered. No longer just an anonymous waitress. No longer someone who feared losing a small, thankless job. Now, she was part of something bigger, something that would change her life forever. And as the bright sunlight illuminated the road ahead, Jasmine knew her journey had only just begun. Jasmine Carter walked out of Sonny's diner not in defeat, but with the greatest opportunity of her life. She had lost a job, but in return, she had found a true purpose, an opportunity to make a difference, to help others, and, most importantly, to never bow to injustice again. Jasmine's story is proof that sometimes loss is not the end. It's the beginning of something greater. What do you think of Jasmine's decision? Would you have the courage to stand up for what's right, even if it meant risking everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to spread this powerful message. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.